My name is Lillian, and I'm 32 years old. That was the moment I learned what it feels like when the person you trusted most throws you to the wolves. The words still echo in my skull like shattered glass. You're nothing but a disgrace. His voice cut through the elegant dining room of Chez Laurent, the most expensive restaurant in the city, where crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows over tables draped in pristine white linen. The silence that followed was deafening. 20 pairs of eyes, his wealthy friends, their diamond-dripping wives, the waitstaff frozen mid-service, all staring at me like I was some exhibit in a freak show. It was my birthday. My 32nd birthday, and I sat there in my best dress, a simple black number I'd saved 3 months to buy, while my husband of 8 years publicly executed what was left of my dignity. The cake they'd brought out moments before sat untouched, its single candle still flickering, mocking me with its cheerful glow. "David, please," I started, but he was already standing, his chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound that made my teeth ache. "Don't," he snarled, his face twisted with a disgust I'd never seen directed at me before. "Just don't. I can't do this anymore, Lillian. I can't pretend you're someone you're not." And then he was gone. Just like that. 8 years of marriage, 8 years of believing in forever, and he walked out of that restaurant, leaving me sitting there with a $4,000 bill and the taste of humiliation burning in my throat like acid. Before we go any further, I need something from you. Drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in the United Kingdom, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in Australia, I want to know. Don't just sit back and listen to my pain without acknowledging you're there. Tell me where in the world you are, because I need to know someone is witnessing this. Now, let me tell you what happened next. The walk home was the longest mile and a half of my life. Every step on those cobblestones felt like walking over broken dreams. The bill, $4,000 for a dinner I barely touched, for champagne that tasted like tears, for the privilege of being humiliated in front of people who never thought I belonged in their world anyway. I paid it. Of course I paid it. What choice did I have? Sit there and let them call the police? Let them add criminal to disgrace? My hands shook as I handed over my credit card, knowing it would max out the account we'd been saving for our anniversary trip to Italy. The trip that would never happen now. The server, a young man with kind eyes, looked at me with such pity I wanted to disappear into the floor. "Ma'am," he whispered, do you need me to call someone?" I shook my head, signed the receipt with my maiden name, Lillian Cross, and walked out into the November night. The whispers started before I even made it to our street. Mrs. Henderson from next door was taking out her trash, and I saw her eyes widen when she spotted me walking alone. She ducked back inside, no doubt already dialing her gossiping circle. By the time I reached our front door, my front door now, I supposed, the curtains were twitching in every window on the block. Poor thing, I heard Mrs. Chin murmur to her husband as I fumbled with my keys. I always said that husband of hers was no good. She must have done something, came a harsher voice from across the street. Men don't just leave for no reason. They don't know, I thought as I finally got the door open. They don't know that for 8 years, I've been shrinking myself smaller and smaller, trying to fit into David's world. They don't know about the job I gave up because he said it embarrassed him. They don't know about the friends I lost because they weren't suitable for his social circle. They don't know about the dreams I buried because they weren't ambitious enough, sophisticated enough, wealthy enough. The house felt like a mausoleum. Every room echoed with memories that now felt like lies. The wedding photos on the mantelpiece seemed to mock me with their frozen smiles. The bed we'd shared for 8 years stretched out before me, cold and vast and empty. I didn't cry that first night. I was too numb, too broken, too nothing. I lay there in my birthday dress, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence that seemed to press down on my chest like a weight. The shame burned inside me like a fever, making my skin feel too tight, my breath too shallow. I was 32 years old, and I had nothing. No career, I'd given that up for him. No close friends, I'd let him isolate me from them one by one. No money of my own, everything was in his name, his accounts, his world. The cold sheets wrapped around me like a shroud, and for the first time since childhood, I felt truly, utterly alone. If you've ever been abandoned by someone you loved, hit subscribe, don't just listen, stand with me. And if you won't, at least tell me why in the comments. Why walk away from someone else's pain? Why turn your back when someone is bleeding in front of you? I must have finally fallen asleep sometime near dawn, because the next thing I knew, my phone was buzzing like an angry wasp. 23 missed calls. 23. The number glowed on my screen like an accusation. My heart hammered against my ribs. David. It had to be David, calling to apologize, calling to explain, calling to tell me it was all some horrible mistake. I fumbled for the phone, my hands still shaking from exhaustion and shock. But it wasn't David's name on the screen. It was a number I didn't recognize, with a stern, professional voicemail. Miss Cross, this is Harold Westbrook from Westbrook, Martinez and Associates. I'm calling regarding the estate of your late father, Richard Cross. Please return this call immediately. It's a matter of extreme urgency. My father. Dead for 15 years, a man I barely remembered except for the smell of his aftershave and the way he used to read me bedtime stories before the cancer took him. What could a lawyer possibly want regarding his estate? We'd been poor when he died. There was nothing to inherit but debts and medical bills that had haunted my mother until the day she followed him to the grave 5 years later. I called the number back with trembling fingers. Miss Cross. The voice was crisp, authoritative. Thank you for returning my call. I have some rather extraordinary news regarding your father's affairs. Are you sitting down? I wasn't, but I sank into the kitchen chair anyway, my legs suddenly unable to support me. Your father, before his death, held a significant stake in Cross Industries, a company that has grown considerably over the past decade and a half. Due to some recently discovered documentation and a legal oversight that has now been corrected, you are the rightful heir to his 47% controlling interest in the company. The words hit me like physical blows. Cross Industries. I knew that name. Everyone in the city knew that name. They owned half the commercial real estate downtown, had their fingers in shipping, technology, construction. They were worth. How much? I whispered. The current valuation puts your inheritance at approximately $230 million. The phone slipped from my hand and clattered onto the kitchen table. $230 million. The number didn't seem real. It couldn't be real. Yesterday I was nothing, nobody, a disgrace. Today I was. The phone buzzed again. A text message. David, Lillian, we need to talk. I was upset last night. You know how I get under pressure. Call me. Then another, Lil, please. I heard about the inheritance. We can work this out. Another, the guys are asking about you. They want to apologize. We all do. I stared at those messages, and something cold and hard crystallized in my chest. They knew. Somehow, they already knew. The same people who had watched me be humiliated, who had whispered behind their hands as I sat there in my cheap dress eating birthday cake alone, they knew about the money, and suddenly I was worth their attention again. My phone rang. Another unknown number. Miss Cross? This is Richard Manning. I believe you know my name. I did. Manning Construction, one of David's golf buddies. One of the men who had watched my husband call me a disgrace without saying a word. I was hoping we could arrange a meeting. There are some business opportunities I'd love to discuss with you. I hung up. The phone rang again immediately. Gerald Thompson from Thompson Holdings. Hung up. Again. Marcus Webb from Webb Financial. Hung up. They were like vultures circling a carcass, and they thought I was going to be easy prey. They thought the broken woman from last night would be grateful for their attention, their sudden interest, their fake smiles and hollow apologies. They were wrong. My lawyer now, not David's, was a sharp woman named Catherine Mills who wore her gray hair like a crown and her intelligence like armor. She met me at her office that afternoon, her conference room overlooking the city that suddenly looked different to me. Smaller somehow. More conquerable. "The calls will continue," she said, sliding documents across the mahogany table toward me. "They know what you're worth now, and they'll all want a piece of it. Your husband's little friend group built their fortunes on connections and collaborations. Without access to cross-industries resources, several of them are facing some rather uncomfortable financial realities." "Good," I said, and the viciousness in my own voice surprised me. Catherine smiled, the expression sharp as a blade. "I like you already. My advice? Let them sweat. Don't take their calls, don't respond to their messages. The longer you wait, the more desperate they'll become. And desperate people make mistakes." Over the next week, my phone never stopped buzzing. David's messages evolved from casual to concerned to angry to panicked to pleading. His friends tried different tactics. Some attempted intimidation. Others offered partnerships that would have made me laugh if I weren't so angry. A few even tried to use their wives as intermediaries, having them reach out woman to woman, sister to sister, as if we were all part of some sorority of suffering that would make me forgive and forget. I ignored them all. Instead, I went shopping. Not the careful, budget-conscious shopping I'd done for 8 years, watching every penny and justifying every purchase. I walked into Saks Fifth Avenue and bought an entirely new wardrobe. Clothes that fit properly, that were made from fabrics that felt like silk against my skin, that made me look like the woman I was becoming instead of the woman I'd been shrinking into. I hired a personal trainer, a nutritionist, a stylist. I got my hair cut and colored by the same woman who did the mayor's wife. I learned to carry myself differently, to speak with authority instead of apology, to take up space instead of making myself smaller. Every morning, I looked in the mirror and saw myself changing. The broken woman from the restaurant was disappearing, replaced by someone harder, stronger, untouchable. Someone who looked like she belonged in boardrooms and penthouses, someone who looked like she could buy and sell the people who had humiliated her. The transformation wasn't just external. Something fundamental had shifted inside me, some core of steel I didn't know I possessed. The shame that had burned in my chest for years was cooling into something else. Something dangerous. Subscribe right now if you believe silence can be the loudest form of revenge. If you disagree, comment below. Tell me why. Tell me why you think the wrong should speak up immediately, should forgive quickly, should make it easy for the people who broke them. 3 weeks after my inheritance became public knowledge, David sent me an invitation. Not a text, not a casual phone call, but an actual embossed invitation to dinner at his favorite restaurant. Not the place where he'd humiliated me, but somewhere equally expensive, equally public. The kind of place where appearances mattered more than truth. To discuss our future, the note said in his careful handwriting, "I miss you, Lil. Let me make this right." I stared at that invitation for a long time, running my fingers over the expensive cardstock, feeling the raised lettering under my fingertips. Then I called Catherine. "Should I go?" I asked. "Do you want to go?" "Yes," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "I think I do." "Then go. But remember, you hold all the cards now. Don't let them forget it." The night of the dinner, I chose my outfit like I was choosing armor. A red dress, not the modest black one I'd worn to my humiliation, but something that commanded attention. Something that said I belonged here, that I owned the air I breathed. My new stylist had taught me about power dressing, about how the right clothes could change not just how others saw you, but how you saw yourself. The restaurant was exactly what I'd expected, all dark wood and soft lighting, the kind of place where deals were made over whiskey and cigars, where money spoke louder than love ever could. I arrived exactly on time, not early like the eager-to-please woman I used to be, not late like someone who didn't respect other people's time. Exactly on time, like someone who had better things to do, but was graciously making an exception. The maitre d' led me to a private dining room where David waited with his inner circle, the same men who had watched him abandon me, who were now desperately trying to save their own skins. Richard Manning sat to David's right, his face flushed with expensive wine and nervous sweat. Gerald Thompson drummed his fingers on the table, his usual cocky confidence replaced by something that looked suspiciously like fear. Marcus Webb couldn't even meet my eyes. But it was David who held my attention. My husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, looked smaller somehow. The expensive suit couldn't hide the weight he'd lost, the lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and mounting pressure. He stood when I entered, that familiar smile spreading across his face like he was greeting an old friend instead of the woman he'd publicly destroyed. "Lillian," he said, moving to pull out my chair. "You look incredible." I let him seat me, let him play the part of the gentleman, all while watching the way his friends stared at me like I was a completely different species than the broken woman they remembered. The red dress had done its job. I looked powerful, untouchable, like someone who belonged in their world but didn't need their approval to stay there. "Thank you," I said simply, accepting the glass of wine David poured for me. It was a vintage that cost more than most people's monthly salary, and I sipped it like it was water. The small talk lasted exactly long enough for the appetizers to arrive. Then David cleared his throat, that nervous gesture I'd seen 1,000 times before, but that now struck me as pathetic rather than endearing. "Lillian, I want to apologize," he began, his voice taking on that smooth, persuasive tone he used in business negotiations. "The other night, I was under tremendous pressure. The deal with Morrison Industries had just fallen through, and I was stressed. I finished for him, setting down my wine glass with deliberate precision. "Yes, you mentioned that in your texts." "Several times." His face flushed slightly, but he pressed on. "It was unacceptable behavior. I know that. I embarrassed you and I embarrassed myself. It wasn't who I really am, you know that." Around the table, his friends nodded like trained seals, their faces masks of concern and understanding. Richard Manning leaned forward, his voice oily with false sincerity. "We all feel terrible about that night, Lillian. We should have spoken up, should have said something." David was clearly not himself. Clearly, I agreed, and something in my tone made them all shift uncomfortably. David reached across the table, trying to take my hand. I let him, curious to see where this performance would lead. "The point is," he continued, "we're family. We've been through too much together to let one bad night destroy everything we've built. I know you're probably feeling overwhelmed with all this inheritance business, all these new responsibilities. You don't have to handle it alone, Lil. We're a team." There it was. The real reason for this dinner, this apology, this sudden concern for my well-being. They needed me. Not as a wife, not as a person, but as a source of funding for their failing ventures. As a signature on contracts that would save their crumbling empire. I pulled my hand away from his slowly, deliberately. "You're right about one thing, David. That night wasn't who you really are." I paused, letting the words settle over the table like smoke. "It was who you've always been. I was just too naive to see it." The silence that followed was electric. I could feel their collective breath being held, their carefully constructed hopes beginning to crack. "The woman you married, the woman you called a disgrace, she would have forgiven you by now. She would have apologized for whatever imaginary slight caused your stress. She would have made it easy for you to pretend that night never happened." I stood up, my chair sliding back silently on the plush carpet. "But that woman is gone. You killed her when you walked out of that restaurant and left her to pay for your cruelty." David's face was pale now, all pretense of control evaporating. "Lillian, please, you're being dramatic. It was one mistake." "It wasn't a mistake." My voice cut through his pleading like a knife. "Mistakes are accidental. What you did was a choice. You chose to humiliate me in front of your friends because you thought I was powerless to stop you. You chose to abandon me on my birthday because you thought I had nowhere else to go. You chose to treat me like I was nothing because you believed I was nothing. I picked up my purse, a designer bag that probably cost more than David's monthly car payment. The funny thing is, you were right. The woman you married was nothing. She had no power, no money, no independence. She existed entirely at your mercy. I smiled then, and I knew it wasn't a kind expression. But that woman is dead now. And the woman standing here? She owns everything you've spent your life begging for scraps of. The color drained from Richard Manning's face. Lillian, surely we can discuss this like civilized adults. Civilized adults don't abandon their wives on their birthdays, I said without even looking at him. Civilized adults don't humiliate people for sport. You want to talk about civilization? Let's talk about how you all sat there and watched your friend destroy his wife's dignity and not one of you said a word. How civilized was that? Gerald Thompson tried a different approach, his voice taking on the wheedling tone of a man who smelled his own desperation. Look, we all need each other here. Cross Industries has always worked with our companies. Your father understood the value of partnership. My father is dead, I said, and the finality in my voice stopped him mid-sentence. I'm not him. I don't share his loyalties or his obligations. The only thing I inherited from him was money, and I plan to be much more selective about how I spend it. I turned back to David, this man I'd loved for 8 years, who had been the center of my world for so long I'd forgotten how to exist without him. He looked smaller now, diminished, like a photograph left too long in the sun. You called me a disgrace, I said quietly. But disgrace implies I brought shame to something worthy of respect. What exactly did I disgrace, David? Your ego? Your carefully constructed image? Your belief that you could treat people however you wanted without consequences. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. No smooth words now, no practiced charm. Just a man watching his world crumble in real time. The disgrace isn't me, I continued. The disgrace is spending 8 years of my life believing I was lucky to be married to a man who never saw me as anything more than an accessory. The disgrace is letting myself become so small that I forgot I ever had the capacity to be anything else. I walked to the door, then paused, my hand on the handle. Oh, and David? The papers will be filed Monday morning. I assume you'll hear from my lawyer. As I walked out, leaving them sitting in their expensive private dining room with their half-eaten meals and their shattered plans, I heard David call after me one last time. Lillian, wait. You can't just. But I could. And I did. If this moment gave you chills, don't scroll away without subscribing. And if you still won't, tell me why refuse to stand with someone who finally rose above betrayal? Why turn away when someone finally finds the strength to fight back? The aftermath was swift and merciless. Within days, the local business journal ran a feature about Cross Industries' new direction under dynamic leadership. The article mentioned, almost in passing, that several long-standing partnerships would be reevaluated as the company moved forward. I didn't have to lift a finger. Catherine handled everything with the efficiency of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a general. Contracts that David's friends had taken for granted for years suddenly came up for renewal. Loans that had been rubber-stamped based on their connections to Cross Industries were called in for review. Joint ventures that had operated on handshake agreements found themselves requiring extensive documentation and guarantees. Richard Manning's construction company lost the bid for 3 major projects in a single week. Without the preferential treatment he'd enjoyed through his friendship with David, his inflated prices and corner-cutting practices couldn't compete with hungrier, more honest competitors. Gerald Thompson's holding company watched its stock price plummet as investors realized how heavily it depended on Cross Industries partnerships. When those partnerships evaporated, so did confidence in Thompson's ability to deliver returns. Marcus Webb's financial firm hemorrhaged clients as word spread that their inside track to one of the city's most influential companies had vanished overnight. In the shark-infested waters of high finance, perception was everything, and the perception was that Webb had fallen from grace. But it was David who fell the hardest. The divorce papers hit him like a sledgehammer. I wasn't asking for alimony, I didn't need his money anymore. I wasn't fighting for the house. I could buy 10 better ones without blinking. I was simply cutting him loose, excising him from my life like a surgeon removing a tumor. His law firm, the one I'd been funneling clients to through Cross Industries, suddenly found their phones less busy. His club memberships, paid for by the connections I now controlled, became burdens he couldn't afford. His carefully curated lifestyle, built on the assumption that his marriage gave him access to power, crumbled like a house of cards in a hurricane. The society pages that had once fawned over him now whispered about his messy personal life and professional instability. The same people who had witnessed my humiliation at the restaurant now crossed the street to avoid him, as if failure were contagious. I watched it all from my new penthouse apartment, 40 floors above the city that had once seemed so vast and intimidating. From up here, the people who had made me feel small looked like ants, scurrying around their tiny lives while I moved pieces on a chessboard they couldn't even see. The neighbors who had gossiped about me after my walk of shame now whispered about David's increasingly erratic behavior. Mrs. Henderson, who had pitted me so publicly, mentioned to Mrs. Chin that she'd seen him sitting in his car outside our old house for hours, just staring at the windows like he could will me back into existence. I always knew that marriage wouldn't last, Mrs. Chin replied, the same woman who had suggested I must have done something to deserve abandonment. She was too good for him anyway. The revision of history would have been funny if it weren't so predictable. People always wanted to be on the winning side, even if it meant rewriting their own memories. But the most satisfying moment came 3 months after the divorce was finalized. I was leaving a board meeting, my first as the official head of Cross Industries, when I saw him. David stood outside the building, not quite loitering but clearly waiting. He looked terrible. The expensive suits couldn't hide the weight loss, the sleepless nights etched in the lines around his eyes, the way his hands shook slightly when he thought no one was looking. This was what desperation looked like in a tailored package. Lillian, he called as I emerged from the revolving doors. Please, just 5 minutes. I could have kept walking. Could have pretended I didn't hear him, let my security team handle the problem. But curiosity won out over caution, and I stopped. 5 minutes, I agreed, glancing at my watch. Starting now. He rushed toward me like a drowning man grabbing for a life preserver. I've been thinking about what you said that night at dinner. You were right. About everything. I treated you terribly, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Lil. For minutes and 30 seconds. The countdown rattled him, made his apology more frantic, less rehearsed. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I destroyed something beautiful. But I've changed. Losing you, losing everything, it made me realize what really matters. 3 minutes. I'm in therapy, he said desperately. I'm working on myself, trying to understand why I became the kind of man who could hurt the person he loved most. I want to be better, Lillian. I want to be the man you deserved all along. I studied his face, this man I'd shared a bed with for 8 years, whose coffee preferences I still remembered, who used to hold me during thunderstorms because he knew they scared me. There was genuine pain there, real regret. The suffering was authentic. It just didn't matter. 1 minute, I said. Please, he whispered, and his voice cracked like a teenager's. I'll do anything. I'll sign whatever prenup you want, give up any claim to your money. I just want my wife back. I just want us back. I let him finish, let him exhaust himself against the wall of my indifference. When the minute was up, I spoke. David, do you remember what you said that night? When you called me a disgrace. He flinched. I was angry. You said you couldn't pretend I was someone I wasn't anymore. Do you remember that? Yes, but... You were right. You couldn't pretend anymore because the mask had slipped. For just a moment, I saw who you really were underneath all the charm and the promises. I saw the man who could humiliate his wife in public and feel justified doing it. I stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough to smell the cologne I used to love. The woman you want back? The one who would have forgiven you by now, who would have made excuses for your behavior, who would have blamed herself for your cruelty. She's gone, David. You killed her that night. And I'm grateful to you for it. His face crumpled. Lillian. Because she was weak. She was so desperate to be loved that she made herself smaller and smaller until there was almost nothing left. But from her ashes rose someone stronger. Someone who doesn't need your approval or your love or your promises to change. I turned to walk away, then paused. You want to know the real irony? If you had just been a decent husband, not perfect, not extraordinary, just decent, you would have had access to all of this forever. The money, the power, the connections. All you had to do was not humiliate me on my birthday. That was the bar, David. Don't publicly destroy your wife's dignity. And you couldn't clear it. The last I saw of him, he was standing on the sidewalk outside Cross Industries, watching my car disappear into traffic. In my rearview mirror, he looked like what he was, a small man who had gambled everything on his ability to keep a good woman broken and lost. The courtroom was sterile and cold, all marble and mahogany and the weight of institutional authority. Judge Patricia Hawthorne presided over the final dissolution of my marriage with the efficiency of someone who had seen too many lives torn apart to be moved by any individual tragedy. But this wasn't a tragedy. This was a liberation. David sat at the respondent's table with his lawyer, a public defender, since his previous legal team had become too expensive once his access to Cross Industries dried up. He kept glancing at me like he couldn't quite believe this was really happening, like some part of him still thought his charm could turn this around. My legal team occupied most of our side of the courtroom. Catherine led the charge, her silver hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights, her presence commanding even in this room designed to diminish everyone who entered it. Behind her sat a phalanx of associates and specialists, all focused on the task of surgically removing David from my life. In the matter of Cross versus Cross, Judge Hawthorne began, her voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. I have reviewed all submitted documentation regarding the dissolution of marriage and the distribution of assets. The terms were simple because I had made them simple. David got nothing from my inheritance. It wasn't marital property, having come after our separation. He could keep his personal effects, his remaining business interests, and whatever was left of his reputation. Everything else, the house, the cars, the joint accounts that had never really been joint, I was keeping or liquidating as I saw fit. Furthermore, the judge continued, the court recognizes the prenuptial agreement signed prior to the 2025 inheritance, which clearly delineates the separate nature of inherited assets. There had been no prenup when we married. I'd drawn up the document retroactively with Catherine's help, a legal fiction that became reality through careful maneuvering and David's desperate willingness to sign anything that might salvage some relationship between us. He'd hoped it was a step toward reconciliation. Instead, it was a step toward the executioner's block. The respondent waives all rights to spousal support and acknowledges that the division of assets as outlined in the settlement agreement is fair and equitable. I watched David sign the papers that officially ended our marriage, his pen scratching across the documents like claws on a coffin lid. His signature was shaky, uncertain, the handwriting of a man whose world had fundamentally shifted beneath his feet. When it was my turn, I signed with the Mont Blanc pen my father had left me, the only inheritance I'd known about before the lawyers called. My signature was firm, confident, final. Lillian Cross, no longer hyphenated, no longer diminished by association. The judge's gavel fell with the finality of a closing door. This court hereby grants the dissolution of marriage between the parties. The decree will be entered into the record immediately. And, just like that, I was free. David tried to approach me as we filed out of the courtroom, but Catherine's security detail, a necessary precaution given the amount of money now attached to my name, formed a polite but impenetrable barrier between us. I saw him mouth my name, saw the desperate gesture of his hands, but the sound was lost in the echo of footsteps on marble. In the parking garage, Catherine paused beside my car, a Tesla Model S that whispered power instead of screaming it. "How does it feel?" she asked. I considered the question. How did it feel to be officially, legally, completely free of the man who had once been the center of my universe? How did it feel to have my name back, my identity separate from his approval or disapproval? Like I can breathe again, I said finally. I drove away from that courthouse with the windows down and the music up, leaving behind 8 years of marriage and 32 years of believing I was less than enough. The woman who had cried herself to sleep in empty beds was gone. The woman who had apologized for taking up space was buried. The woman who had made herself small for someone else's comfort was just a memory. In her place sat someone new. Someone who owned her own name, her own choices, her own future. Someone who had learned that the best revenge wasn't destruction, it was transcendence. Behind me, in the rearview mirror, the courthouse shrank until it was just another building in a city full of them. Ahead, the road stretched out like a promise, and for the first time in my adult life, I had no idea where it would lead. That uncertainty should have been terrifying. Instead, it was exhilarating. The sunlight streaming through my windshield felt different somehow, warmer, brighter, like the world itself was welcoming me back from a long and exhausting exile. I was Lillian Cross again, not because I'd inherited money or power, but because I'd inherited myself. They called me a disgrace. But today, I stand as someone they'll never reach again. Sometimes the best revenge is simply never looking back. What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. And if you can hear this story, feel this pain, and still refuse to subscribe, at least be honest. Why turn away from truth when it's right here in front of you? But this isn't where the story ends. This is where it begins. Because you need to understand how I got here. You need to see the woman I was before I became the woman I am. You need to witness the slow erosion of self that happens when you love someone more than you love yourself. I met David on a Tuesday in September, 8.5 years before he would call me a disgrace in front of his friends. I was 23, fresh out of college with a degree in marketing and dreams bigger than my bank account. He was 26, already climbing the corporate ladder at his father's firm, wearing confidence like cologne. The coffee shop where we met was nothing special. A cramped space near my first apartment, where the baristas knew my order and the Wi-Fi was strong enough for job hunting. I was nursing a latte I couldn't afford, scrolling through employment websites on my ancient laptop when he approached my table. "Excuse me," he said, and his voice was honey over gravel, smooth and rich and designed to get attention. "I'm sorry to bother you, but you look like you're fighting a war with that computer." I looked up to find him smiling down at me, all white teeth and expensive haircut, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my rent. He was handsome in that effortless way that rich men often are: good bone structure, clear skin, the kind of health that comes from never having to choose between groceries and medicine. "Job hunting," I said, gesturing at the screen full of rejection emails. "The computer's winning." He laughed, and the sound made something flutter in my chest. "Mind if I sit? I might be able to help." That should have been my first warning. Rich men who offer to help strange women in coffee shops usually want something in return. But I was 23 and lonely and tired of eating ramen for dinner, so I gestured to the empty chair across from me. "David Westfield," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, confident, the handshake of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. "Lillian Cross," I replied, acutely aware of how young I sounded next to his polished professionalism. "What kind of work are you looking for, Lillian Cross?" I told him about my degree, my modest experience, my dream of working for a firm that did meaningful marketing for good causes. He listened with the kind of attention I wasn't used to receiving from men, his eyes never leaving my face, his head tilted slightly like every word I spoke was fascinating. "I might know someone," he said when I finished. "My father's company works with several nonprofits. I could make some calls." The job interview he arranged led to my first real position at a marketing firm that specialized in charitable organizations. The work was everything I'd hoped for: creative, meaningful, challenging. I threw myself into it with the enthusiasm of someone who had finally found her place in the world. David and I started dating 2 weeks after I got the job. He took me to restaurants where I had to Google the menu beforehand, bought me clothes that made me feel like playing dress up, introduced me to a world where people discuss stock portfolios over brunch and vacation homes like they were discussing the weather. I should have noticed how he never asked about my work, only about whether I was happy. I should have seen the way he steered conversations away from my successes and toward his plans for our future. I should have recognized the subtle ways he was already reshaping me, already determining which parts of my personality were acceptable and which needed to be modified. But I was in love. Drunk on it, drowning in it, completely intoxicated by the idea that someone like David Westfield could want someone like me. When he told me I was beautiful, I believed him. When he said I was special, I felt special. When he suggested that my work was stressing me out too much, that maybe I should consider something less demanding, I listened. The erosion happened slowly, like waves wearing away a coastline. First, he suggested I stop working late nights. He missed me. He wanted to spend more time together. Then he pointed out that my college friends were holding me back, that I was too sophisticated for their childish interests now. Gradually, he convinced me that my job was beneath my potential, that I could do so much more if I just trusted him to guide me. By the time he proposed, I had already given up the work I loved, lost touch with most of my friends, and developed the habit of checking his face for approval before voicing any opinion. The ring was beautiful, a 2-carat solitaire that caught the light like captured stars, but I remember feeling oddly hollow when he slipped it onto my finger. "You're going to be so happy," he said, kissing me in the middle of the restaurant where he'd arranged for the proposal to happen. Everyone clapped, strangers congratulating us on our fairy tale romance, and I smiled until my cheeks ached. I was going to be happy. I had to be. I'd given up everything else. The wedding was everything David wanted: elegant, expensive, perfectly orchestrated to impress his family and friends. I felt like an actress playing a role, floating through the ceremony in a dress that cost more than most people's cars, promising to love and honor a man I was already disappearing for. The early years of marriage weren't unhappy exactly. They were gray, muted. I existed in the space David created for me, a carefully climate-controlled environment where I was protected from stress, challenge, and anything that might disturb his vision of domestic tranquility. I tried to find work again after the honeymoon, but David's concerns were always so reasonable. This job had too much travel. That one would require too many hours. This company had a bad reputation. That one wouldn't appreciate my talents. Gradually, I stopped looking. It was easier to let him support us financially while I supported him emotionally, managing his social calendar, organizing his business dinners, being the perfect wife for the ambitious young executive. I told myself I was lucky. How many women had husbands who wanted to take care of them? How many got to live in beautiful houses and wear beautiful clothes and never worry about money? I was living the dream that magazines sold and movies promised. So why did I feel like I was suffocating? The cracks in my perfect life started small. A comment here about how I'd gained weight. A suggestion there about how I should style my hair. Little corrections to my grammar, my posture, my choice of conversation topics at parties. Always delivered with love, always for my own good, always designed to help me be the best version of myself. The best version of myself, it turned out, was a woman who agreed with David about everything, who never challenged his decisions, who existed as a beautiful, silent accessory to his increasingly successful career. By year 5, I had perfected the art of invisible existence. I knew how to laugh at his friends' jokes without drawing attention to myself. I knew how to dress appropriately for every occasion without upstaging anyone important. I knew how to make myself useful without being inconvenient. I was the ghost of the woman I used to be, haunting my own life. The friends who tried to maintain contact eventually gave up when I consistently declined invitations, canceled plans, and failed to return calls. David was always so sorry when conflicts arose, But business came first, and surely they understood that my husband's career had to be the priority. My family, what little I had left after my parents died, grew tired of being politely deflected every time they asked when we might visit. David's family became my family, his friends became our friends, his interests became our interests. I measured my worth by his satisfaction with me. Good days were days when he came home in a pleasant mood, when dinner was perfect, when I had handled some social obligation to his exact specifications. Bad days were days when I fell short of his expectations, when I said the wrong thing or wore the wrong outfit or failed to anticipate his needs. The truly insidious part was how reasonable it all seemed. He never raised his voice, never called me names, never laid a hand on me in anger. He just guided me, shaped me, molded me into the woman he needed me to be, one small concession at a time. And I let him. God help me, I collaborated in my own erasure because I thought that was what love looked like. The night of my 32nd birthday, when he stood up in that restaurant and called me a disgrace, wasn't the beginning of my nightmare. It was the end of it. Because in that moment, when he said he couldn't pretend I was someone I wasn't anymore, I finally saw the truth. I wasn't someone he could be proud of because I had become no one at all. The woman who walked out of that restaurant and paid that $4,000 bill was a hollow shell, a carefully constructed facade with nothing inside. The woman who inherited her father's fortune was still that shell, but with the resources to build something new. The woman who walked out of that final dinner with David and his friends was someone else entirely. Someone who remembered what it felt like to have opinions, preferences, dreams that didn't require anyone else's approval. The woman who signed those divorce papers was free. But freedom, I learned, is not the same as healing. It's not the same as rebuilding. It's not the same as figuring out who you are when you're not defined by someone else's needs. The months after the divorce were strange and disorienting. I had more money than I knew what to do with, more power than I'd ever imagined possessing, and absolutely no idea what I actually wanted from life. For 8 years, my wants had been David's wants. My goals had been his goals. My happiness had been contingent on his approval. Now I had to learn how to want things for myself again. I started small. I bought groceries based on what I felt like eating, not what David preferred. I chose movies based on my own taste, not his sophisticated preferences. I read books he would have considered frivolous, listened to music he would have found annoying, wore clothes that made me happy instead of appropriate. It sounds simple, but it was revolutionary. Every choice I made for myself, no matter how minor, was an act of rebellion against 8 years of self-erasure. I hired a therapist, Dr. Sarah Chin, a woman who specialized in helping people rebuild their sense of self after emotionally controlling relationships. She didn't judge me for my years of compliance or my sudden windfall of power. She just helped me excavate the woman I used to be before David's love taught me to hide her away. "You're not damaged," she told me during one of our early sessions. "You're dormant. There's a difference." She was right. Underneath all the conditioning and compromise, all the years of making myself smaller, the woman I used to be was still there. Buried, maybe. Forgotten, possibly. But not destroyed. Learning to trust my own judgment again was like learning to walk after a long illness. I second-guessed every decision, looked for external validation, caught myself automatically deferring to others before remembering that I didn't have to anymore. But slowly, gradually, I began to remember what it felt like to be a whole person instead of half of a couple. I rejoined the board of directors at Cross Industries, not because I had to, but because I wanted to understand the business my father had built. The work was challenging in ways I hadn't experienced in years, demanding skills I'd forgotten I possessed. My colleagues, some of whom remembered my father, treated me with respect that had nothing to do with my marital status or social connections. For the first time in almost a decade, I felt useful for my mind instead of my appearance. I bought a house, not the mansion David would have chosen to impress his friends, but a smaller place with character and history and windows that faced east so I could watch the sunrise. I filled it with books and art and furniture that pleased me, creating a space that felt like home instead of a showroom. I traveled alone, something that would have horrified the old Lillian, who couldn't imagine being in a restaurant or hotel by herself. But I discovered the joy of moving through the world on my own terms, of making spontaneous decisions without consulting anyone, of being anonymous in foreign cities where no one knew I was supposed to be half of something. Most importantly, I began to forgive myself. For the years I'd wasted, for the woman I'd allowed myself to become, for the dreams I'd abandoned in service of someone else's vision of who I should be. The anger that had sustained me through the divorce began to fade, replaced by something healthier, acceptance. I accepted that I had made choices, even if they seemed like the only options at the time. I accepted that David had been who he was, and I had been who I was, and together we had created something toxic that neither of us recognized until it was too late. I accepted that I couldn't go back and save the 23-year-old woman who fell for his charm, but I could honor her by becoming someone she would be proud of. A year after the divorce, I ran into one of David's former friends at a charity gala, not one of the inner circle who had fallen with him, but a peripheral figure who had managed to maintain his business relationships despite the reshuffling of social hierarchies. "Lillian," he said, approaching me during the cocktail hour. You look incredible." I did. The red dress I wore that night wasn't armor this time. It was simply a dress I liked, chosen because it made me feel beautiful instead of powerful. The difference was subtle but fundamental. "Thank you," I said, accepting the compliment without deflection or self-deprecation. "I have to ask," he continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "How are you handling all this? The divorce, the business, everything." It was a question I'd been asked dozens of times in various forms, usually by people fishing for gossip or evidence of my inability to cope without David's guidance. "I'm handling it by living it," I said simply. "One day at a time." He looked puzzled, as if he'd expected something more dramatic, tales of revenge plots or nervous breakdowns or desperate attempts to win David back. "And David," he pressed. "Have you two spoken at all?" I thought about that question. Had we spoken? There had been the attempted ambush outside my office building, the pathetic pleading in the parking garage, the signed papers passed through lawyers. But speaking? Actually communicating as two human beings? There's nothing left to say, I realized aloud. We never really spoke anyway. Not about anything that mattered. That was the truth I'd been avoiding for months. Our entire relationship had been built on his monologues and my agreements, his preferences and my accommodations. We had never been partners in any real sense. I had been his audience, his supporting cast, his beautiful backdrop. The real tragedy wasn't that he had revealed his true nature that night in the restaurant. The real tragedy was that I had spent 8 years never revealing mine. 2 years after the divorce, David tried one final time. The letter arrived on expensive stationery, hand-delivered to my office by a courier who waited for a response. The familiar handwriting made my chest tighten, but not with longing, with the muscle memory of anxiety, the conditioned response of someone who had spent too long walking on eggshells. "Lillian," it began, "I know I have no right to contact you, but I needed you to know that I understand now what I lost. Not the money or the connections or the social status, though losing those has been its own kind of education. I lost the woman I should have treasured above everything else." The letter was eloquent, heartfelt, and utterly beside the point. He wrote about therapy and growth and the man he was becoming, about regret and responsibility and his deep, abiding love for the woman he had driven away. "I'm not asking for another chance," he concluded. "I know I don't deserve one. I'm asking for forgiveness. Not for my sake, but for yours. I can't bear the thought of you carrying the poison of what I did to you." I read the letter twice, then set it aside and went back to reviewing quarterly reports. An hour later, I picked it up again, looking for some emotional response that never came. Catherine found me that evening, still sitting in my office with the letter on my desk. "Bad news?" she asked, settling into the chair across from me. "I'm not sure," I said honestly. David wrote to apologize. Really apologize this time. He wants my forgiveness. Catherine raised an eyebrow. And I don't feel anything about it. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even pity. It's like reading about someone else's life. She nodded slowly. That's probably healthy. Is it? Shouldn't I feel something? After 8 years of marriage, after everything that happened, what do you think you should feel? I considered the question. I used to imagine this moment. In the early days after the divorce, when I was still angry, I fantasized about him groveling. I wanted him to suffer the way he made me suffer. I wanted him to feel small and powerless and disposable. And now I realize that would have been another way of letting him control my emotions. Another way of making my well-being dependent on his actions. I picked up the letter one more time, then dropped it into the shredder beside my desk. I don't forgive him, I said, watching the expensive paper turn into confetti. Not because I want to punish him, but because forgiveness implies a relationship where one person owes something to another. We don't have a relationship anymore. His guilt is his to carry, not mine to resolve. Catherine smiled, one of her rare, genuine expressions that transformed her entire face. Now that, she said, is the voice of someone who's truly free. 3 years after my divorce, 5 years after that terrible birthday dinner, I finally understood what had happened to me. Not just the obvious things, the emotional manipulation, the systematic erosion of my independence, the public humiliation that had finally broken the spell. But the deeper, more insidious transformation that had occurred over 8 years of loving someone who confused control with care. I had learned to disappear in plain sight. To exist without taking up space, to have opinions without expressing them, to want things without pursuing them. I had become a ghost in my own life, present but not participating, visible but not seen. The money hadn't saved me. The power hadn't liberated me. The revenge hadn't healed me. What saved me was the simple, revolutionary act of choosing myself. Not choosing myself over David, that would have still made him the center of the equation. But choosing to exist as a complete person rather than half of a broken whole. The woman I am now bears little resemblance to either version of myself from that story. Not the broken wife who paid for her own humiliation, and not the avenging angel who destroyed her husband's world with calculated precision. Both of those women were defined by David's actions, shaped by his presence or absence. The woman I am now is defined by nothing but her own choices. I still run Cross Industries, but not because I inherited it, because I've earned the right to lead it through competence and vision. I still live in the house I bought after the divorce, but I've filled it with friends who knew nothing about my marriage or my money before they knew me. I still travel alone sometimes, but I also travel with companions who value my thoughts as much as my company. I've learned to trust my own judgment again, to pursue my own interests, to form my own opinions. I've remembered what it feels like to laugh without checking someone else's face first, to speak without measuring every word for potential offense. Most importantly, I've learned the difference between being loved and being needed. David needed me to be small so he could feel big. He needed me to be dependent so he could feel powerful. He needed me to be grateful so he could feel generous. Love, I've discovered, wants you to be exactly who you are. It doesn't ask you to shrink or change or apologize for taking up space. It doesn't require you to earn it through perfect behavior or strategic submission. I'm still learning what that looks like in practice. There are false starts and failed relationships and moments when I catch myself falling back into old patterns. But each time, I recognize it sooner, correct course faster, remember who I am now instead of who I used to be. The story I've told you isn't really about revenge, though revenge played a part. It's not about money, though money provided the means. It's not even about David, though he was the catalyst. It's about remembering that you are allowed to exist. You are allowed to take up space, have preferences, make demands, say no. You are allowed to choose yourself, especially when other people have taught you that your value lies in how well you serve their needs. You are allowed to be a complete person instead of someone's accessory. You are allowed to be the protagonist of your own story instead of the supporting character in someone else's. They called me a disgrace, and maybe I was. Maybe I disgraced the version of womanhood that requires silence and submission and endless accommodation. Maybe I brought shame to the institution of marriage as a trade agreement where women exchange autonomy for security. If so, I wear that disgrace like a badge of honor. Because the alternative, remaining the woman I was, accepting the life I had, continuing to disappear a little more each day until there was nothing left, that would have been the real tragedy. The woman who walked out of that restaurant is gone. The woman who divorced her husband and destroyed his friends and rebuilt herself from the ashes of her old life has served her purpose. The woman who speaks to you now is simply someone who learned to choose herself and who wants you to know that you can choose yourself too. Whatever prison you've built or allowed to be built around you, whatever voice tells you that you're asking for too much or expecting too much or wanting too much, that voice is lying. You are allowed to want everything. You are allowed to demand respect. You are allowed to leave situations and relationships and entire lives that make you smaller than you are. You are allowed to choose yourself. Always. Every time. Without apology or explanation or permission from anyone else. That's not a disgrace. That's the most sacred thing you can do. And if the people in your life can't celebrate that choice, if they can't love the fullness of who you are instead of the convenient fiction of who they need you to be, then they were never really loving you anyway. They were loving their idea of you. Their version of you. Their diminished, manageable, controllable version of you. But you, the real you, the complete you, the unapologetic you, you are worth so much more than that. Choose yourself. Choose yourself like your life depends on it. Because it does.